Hi everyone, I'm Lazy Cat Lady, and today I'm going to do a modern set review for the Murders at Karlov Manor previews. So I did one of these before, but this is kind of how I like to organize my tier list. Um, the D category is stuff that's not really playable. They're just cards that I think look really fun and want to mention. C is playable in weaker decks in Modern, but maybe it's like a weaker archetype. B are cards that I think are worth testing. A is powerful cards that should just show up in the format, and S is stuff that might be broken. All right, so let's jump into the first card. This card is definitely bad, but I think it's a very interesting and fun effect. So Drag the Canal, instant 2 mana, create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. If a creature died this turn, you gain 2 life, surveil 2, then investigate. So I think this is, I at least think it's interesting. It doesn't have like, it's interesting because it just gives you a little bit of value in a bunch of different areas. So I just think it's a cool card. You could play it in like a food deck with Cauldron Familiar and Witch's Oven, and Asmo can get you removal spells to turn this on too. It would be fun. I might try it at some point, but I don't think it's very good. The other card I put in this category is Treacherous Greed. Instant for 3 mana. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature that dealt damage this turn. Draw 3 cards. Each opponent loses 3 life, and you gain 3 life. So this kind of makes sense to try, I think, in a aggressive show with creatures with damage ETBs. So Voldaren Epicure, Orcish Bowmasters, Viashino Pyromancer, all deal the damage when they enter the battlefield. I'm probably going to test something along these lines with like 4 Ether Vial. I think drawing 3 cards only really makes sense if you can just kind of dump your hand out onto the battlefield. So I think Ether Vial is kind of a key part of trying to use this card. But I don't think it's super competitive. Having the creature had to have dealt damage is kind of, a tough ask sometimes. Okay, moving on to the next category. These are cards that I think are good, but maybe belong in weaker archetypes in Modern. So first is Leyline of the Guild Pact. It's another classic Leyline. If it's in your opening hand, you get to begin with it on the battlefield. It gives all non-land permanents you control all colors, and it makes your lands every basic land type. Those abilities aren't necessarily very strong, which is why I don't think it's necessarily going to really impact Modern, but it has 4 green pips. So in combination with Nykthos and Leyline, I think this will power up Mono Green Devotion, but I think Mono Green Devotion has kind of been a weak deck in the format for a while, but definitely makes me want to test it out again. That's one of my pet decks. All right, next card up is Barbed Servitor. 4 mana, indestructible. Basically, whenever it gets dealt damage, target opponent loses that much life. So this becomes kind of a replacement piece for a lot of decks, for like a card like Stuffy Doll, but now it's 4 mana. So I know people have been messing around. I've seen people in my Discord mess around with Asmo decks where you just make a bunch of foods and then deal a Stuffy Doll or Phyrexian Vindicator a bunch of damage. But Phyrexian, I think it's Phyrexian Vindicator's like quadruple white pips, so it's really hard to play in an Asmo shell. But this opens up your mana options. So now you can kind of play this combo a lot more efficiently, both mana and types of mana. So that's an interesting card, but I don't think that combo is, super Modern playable. Next up card, we got something, the Pride of Hull Clade. So this spell costs X less to cast, where X is the total toughness of creatures you control. It's got Defender, and it has this wild 4 mana ability where you can basically make a creature draw cards if it deals damage equal to its toughness. So this is a 2/15, so if this could ever connect, you would get to draw 15 cards. So, it definitely goes in like the Butts decks, but those aren't necessarily very competitive. So I didn't highlight all the cards here because that archetype has a lot of different cards. But, Wall of Roots, Wall of Omens, O4s, draw a card when they enter. So you can ramp this creature out really quick, but I think, Modern can just play around this, Solitude exiles this, and you you only gain 2 life. So definitely not the strongest card, but interesting in that archetype. Next up, we've got Chalk Outline. I definitely saw Spike mention this one, and people were talking about it in my Discord for a bit. 4 mana enchantment. Whenever one or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token, then investigate. With the important part here really being the investigate. If you have, a discard outlet, something like Lotleth Troll, and an Oval Chase Daredevil, you do have to start the loop. You have to have Oval Chase in your graveyard and get it to leave to trigger the Chalk Outline first. But you can easily do that with an Underworld Cookbook. But anyway, then this is an infinite loop where you can just keep pitching it in response to the Investigate trigger, getting it back, and then you get an infinite power Lotleth Troll, infinite 2/2s, and infinite clues. So it doesn't really win on the spot, and it's a 4-mana enchantment. So I think it's an interesting combo, but maybe a little weak for Modern since it doesn't get down until at least turn like 3 or 4. Okay, now we're moving on to into the B category, which is stuff I think could be good and is definitely worth testing. So on this slide, I put 2 cards because I think they're basically they synergize with similar cards, and I think would belong being tested in an Inti deck. So first is Demand Answers, 2 mana, instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or discard a card, draw 2 cards. So in an Asmo Inti shell, you're almost always going to have an artifact laying around, or if you have an Inti in play, you get an extra discard trigger, so it basically becomes, Impulse 1 plus draw 2. So I think it could be really strong as like an extra card advantage engine in an Inti deck. Then you've got Case of the Crimson Pulse, 3 mana enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, discard a card, then draw 2 cards. To solve it, you have to have no cards in hand, which I think is the reason why this might not be great, because, especially in a deck with Oval Chase, you don't necessarily want your hand to be empty. But when it's solved, at the beginning of your upkeep, you get to discard your hand and draw 2 cards. Now, this is, like, wild. Especially in an aggressive deck, like Inti decks tend to want to be, you probably are playing 4 Galvanic Blast, 4 Lightning Bolt. You can just couple turns, just dig through your library, grab some burn spells, and throw them at the opponent. So I think it's a pretty interesting card. The next up, I don't really know exactly what deck this is going to end up in, but Undergrowth Recon, 3 mana enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So, you got fetch lands, Field of Ruin, Ghost Quarter. I feel like this belongs somewhere since it's basically 3 mana ramp every turn. And I think it could be pretty strong. I'm just not sure exactly what shell it goes in. So next up, we've got Analyze the Pollen, 1 mana. As an additional cost to cast this spell, collect evidence 8, search your library for a basic land card. If evidence was collected instead, search your library for a creature or land card, reveal it, put into your hand. So the collect evidence 8 is kind of difficult to get for a lot of decks, and but if you can get it, it's kind of an upgraded Traverse the Ulvenwald. So I've highlighted here Troll of Khazad-dûm, Street Wraith, and Magma Opus. Somebody in my Discord suggested the Magma Opus, which is 8 mana all by itself. But so in some kind of maybe an Asmo deck, maybe an Inti deck, you could run Analyze the Pollen and just have a couple extra copies of access to Inti, since that's your most powerful engine. Magma Opus, 2 mana to discard it and make a treasure token. So just with 2 mana, you can pitch that and use the treasure to cast Analyze the Pollen and go get Urza's Saga, Boseiju, Asmo, Inti. There's a lot of good creature land targets in that kind of shell. I think it could also go in maybe a Reanimator, like an Asmo Reanimator shell. You can go and get your Emrakul, the Aeon's Torn, or an Asmo if you just want removal. So I think it's a pretty interesting card. Next up, we got Insidious Roots. I honestly didn't know whether to put this in B or A because I think it's quite strong, but I think it makes possible decks more reliant on the graveyard than they want to be. But it's a 2 mana enchantment. Creature tokens you control have add 1 mana of any color. Whenever one or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a 0/1 green plant creature token, then put a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control. So with effects like Cauldron Familiar, Witch's Oven, or Cookbook Oval Chase, you just get a plant, you get a 1-2, and then you get a 2-3, and then you get a 3-4, basically, because of it puts a counter on each plant. So you can really blow up the battlefield with a couple cheap, repeatable effects. And then they also ramp you. So I think this is a super interesting card. I think it could also go in an archetype with Agatha's Soul Cauldron and Grist. Getting to turn all your little 0-1 with counters plants into Grist, and maybe also play it in a deck with Walking Ballista, and you can just build your +1/+1 counters so quickly to get those abilities on a bunch of creatures. Okay, next category is A. These are cards I definitely think are going to be seeing play in Modern. We've got Archdruid's Charm, 3 green mana. You can either search for a creature or land, and if it's a land, you just get to put it onto the battlefield tapped. And if it's a creature, it goes to your hand. It has another mode for putting a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, and that creature deals damage to another creature you don't control. And third mode, exile target artifact or enchantment. So this is like any non-basic land ramp that you want, creature tutor, potential removal spell for a creature, and removal, super importantly, for Urza's Saga, the One Ring, etc., since it exiles. So I think this is going to definitely go immediately in Nykthos decks. I think it could have a place in some Saga decks, since you can just tutor one right to the battlefield. Potentially also Valakut decks. I've been trying to brew some Valakut decks that play this. And then also Lotus Field. If you're playing something like Spike's deck where you're using Amulet of Vigors to ramp yourself a bunch with Lotus Fields, Archdruid's Charm, you can pay the triple green with the Lotus Field. If you got 2 amulets in play, that's +3 mana. You can just tutor the land you were looking for right to the battlefield. So I think this is going to be a pretty interesting card to see. Next up, we've got Delny Streetwise Lookout, 3 mana creature. Creatures you control with power 2 or less can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater, and the important part, if an ability of a creature you control with power 2 or less triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. So I think this belongs best in an Abzan Samwise list. Samwise, you get extra food because Samwise is power 2 or less, so you get an extra food every trigger when a creature enters. With Gilded Goose, you get 2 foods. With Orcish Bowmasters, you get 2 pings. With Cauldron Familiar, you get 2 drains. I think this could make a really interesting shell and might make this deck a little more explosive. Usually, I think people have been favoring like Samwise Manufacture Lotus shells to combo off with value, but this, I think, gives the Abzan deck like a much quicker route to a bunch of value. So I think this card is really exciting. Makes me want to play some Abzan Samwise after release. The last card, and probably the one I'm most excited for, is Crime Novelist. When you sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on Crime Novelist and add red mana. The red mana being the most important part. Somebody in my Discard pointed out that any sack outlet and animation module goes infinite because you place a counter on Crime Novelist, and that triggers animation module. You can use the red mana to pay for the animation module trigger, make a 1/1, and then with something like Goblin Bombardment, you can just sack it and loop the triggers again, since it's an artifact creature. It also works just like Urza, Lord High Artificer, does with Thopter Foundry and Sword of the Meek. I think I'm more excited for the animation module Goblin Bombardment line. I think having a Rakdos or Jund sack list where you can take advantage of both of those cards in other ways, and also just have an infinite combo where you just win on the spot, I think that could be a really cool deck. But anyway, that's the final tier list. I didn't put anything in the looks broken category. I don't think we have any the One Rings this set, thankfully, although, could be wrong about, something becoming very strong overnight. But yeah, so that's been my video. I'm really excited for a lot of these cards, and I'll definitely be making videos for some of my favorite ones and posting those soon. Definitely some kind of Rakdos Jund Crime Novelist deck, and probably some Abzan Samwise. So I'm really excited. A lot of these cards are really good in food shells, which are my favorite. That's partially why I highlighted them. So I'm really excited for that, and I'll see you in the next video.